Good afternoon. This is the fourth History Tidbit, and we are live from the office of Helen Alton's home. This is it's the Sheldon Museum, Haines Sheldon Museum, and I am the director, Helen Alton. And our fourth tidbit for you is on the 1900 census. So it's time to go live with it. Now, the purpose of a census is it tells us who we are and where we are going as a nation. So it's a really important document. It happens every 10 years. But up until 1900, it was not a permanent part of the U.S. government. It had to be a special appropriation, a special bill for each of the censuses that we did. The census helps the government decide how to distribute funds and assistance to states and localities. So based on your population, you get certain things from the federal government. And it's also used to draw lines of legislative districts and reapportion seats in Congress. So it's another important part of the census is making sure that your voice will be heard and balanced. Of course, here in Alaska, we've never had more than one representative. For the House of Representatives, we've not had enough people to have more than one seat. So, Alaska, the census and the numbers of people, we really don't have a clear picture, but I'm going to give you a bit of the history of the numbers of people that we had. Steve Langdon from the University of Alaska, Anchorage, his estimate is that before there was European contact, there were 80,000 people in Alaska, and that 15,000 of them were in Southeast Alaska. The biggest hubs were at the mouth of the rivers that then went into the interior. So the two big trade access points into the interior were the Stikine River, which is now Wrangell area, and the Chilkat River, which is now in the Haines area. And so he thinks that pretty much most of the people were there. I've heard as many as 5,000 people in Klukwan or in the Chilkat Peninsula. It may have been even more than that. Now, the Russian period from 1819 to 1863 did not do a good job of counting the people. The Orthodox priests would only count people who were true believers or who were They didn't count anybody who wasn't a Christian. So when they did the census in the areas that they were in, it was a little bit unusual because they didn't count a lot of people. And then the Russian America Company, when it was doing counts, again, it was the people that it saw. So this number of 39,830, they estimate that 17,000 people existed in Alaska that they never met. So they just added 17,000 onto what they knew about. So there was a certain number of people that they counted, there were a certain number of people that they heard about, and then they just put 17,000 more in there. The Russians they never had more than 800 people here. And when you think about it, I mean, we're talking 80,000 people initially, these 800 Russians, and the incredible gall that they had to claim it as theirs and sell it to somebody else, it just is mind-blowing. There were also people that they called Creoles, and those are people that had a native and a Russian parent. So they were, one parent was locally born and bred, and one parent was an import from Russia. These numbers are coming from an 1839 census by Father Yvan Petrov, and I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly, and he later became Bishop Innocent. Just a few of these kind of strange numbers that have been thrown around from the Russian period. In 1819, the Chilkat were estimated to be 5,000. Now, 1819 is before the biggest of the diseases came through. Tikhomenov in 1863 gave the population statistics, and again, we don't know how accurate some of these are. There's also a question as to whether the Russians counted the women or the children, that if maybe it was just the men. But they have before 1837 and 1838, 1837 was 11,000 people they counted. And it's been 10,000, 11,000 people. But then suddenly it drops, and it takes about 3 years to really drop all the way down to 7,470. So they lose almost 3,000 people. And the reason is because of a smallpox epidemic, the first one that came through. It devastated the native populations. And this image is from Mexico. It was a drawing from one of the codexes in Mexico of the smallpox and how it affected the local people. They had, as we have today, no immunities to our COVID-19 epidemic. The native population here was what they call a virgin population. It had absolutely no history of contact with a disease like smallpox. And as a result, they were readily catching it and having severe reactions to it, much more so than the Europeans that brought it in. So here is the Chilkat Valley. The Russians made a deal with the English and allowed the Hudson Bay Company the northern part of Lynn Canal to do with as they wished, to do the trade, that they got the trade and stuff, which was really counter the Tlingit trade networks and Tlingit trade routes. And later in the 1850s, the Chilkats went up and destroyed the Hudson Bay Company fort at Fort Selkirk. But at this point, Sir James Douglas did a census in 1839, and he found that there were 498 people in Lynn Canal. Now, this is reported in Petrov's census, which is after the Americans take over. And the numbers in Douglas's notes and the numbers in the report are a little different. So he's got 167 men in the published report, but his notes say 267. So there may have been some transcription errors. Women, boys, girls, and interestingly enough, he separated out male slaves and female slaves as well. And that is done in a couple of the different censuses that were done during the Russian period. In 1861, Lieutenant Wehrman of the Russian Navy, who was contracted with the Russian-American Company, did a census of the native population, and the Chilkat villages. He listed 1,616 people. Now, whether he actually did a count of the slaves and the males and females I'm not sure of, because those numbers are exactly the same. It's just like he split it down the middle. So I'm not quite sure where he got those numbers or how it worked, but he's listing 1,616 people in our valley in 1861. So they're recovering from the smallpox epidemic. They're building up the population again. Now, the first census, as you know, 1867 is when the United States purchased Alaska from the Russians without knowledge of the Tlingits. And the Tlingits were rather surprised. But in 1870 was a census year. So they decided a census had to be done of the new territory. And the U.S. Army was in control of the territory. So it was under the command of Major General Henry W. Halleck, and they conducted the first official American census of the territory. And it was pretty useless because I'm not quite sure why, but when people started looking at the numbers, he said 82,400 people lived in Alaska. But he duplicated tribes. He listed them under different names. He included tribes that didn't even exist, and he exaggerated estimates. So the number is not considered reliable at all. And when you look at some of the later censuses, even though disease all factored into this, it's pretty obvious that this is an inflated number. And I'm not sure what his purpose was in doing that. There might have been something to do with funding or getting attention from the federal government that he was trying to accomplish that and inflated the numbers. So in 1880, Yvan Petrov, who was a special agent for Alaska, did what is a much more credible assessment. He tried to get to every single part of Alaska and count people. And he counted 33,426 people. Of those, 430 are considered white. So they're not local folks, they're not natives. And 1,756 are Creoles, or they have a native mother or father and a non-native mother or father. And in that census, he counted 6,763 Tlinkits. So the Tlingit population was coming back from some of the diseases that it had suffered from. Petrov's 1880 census was also interesting for some of the maps that it had in it. This is a map showing the different areas, but he also had a really interesting map showing where the bears are. So where the polar bears are, where the brown bears are. And the bears were pretty much on his mind because he was wandering through some pretty rough territory trying to find people. And he ran into a few bears. The 1880 census began in Attu, and he spelled it Attoo, in the far west of the Aleutian Islands on May 1880. So most years, and to this day, the census officially starts June 1st of the census year. But Alaska is so far out of the way that we actually get the census starting here before it starts anywhere else. We're one of the toughest places to count. He had only a few agents working with him, and they tried to visit every part of Alaska. It took them 2 years. They worked the summer of 1880 and the summer of 1881. And then the data that they accumulated was transmitted to the census office on August 7th, 1882. He followed that up with a published report of the population count, and he detailed in that report the culture, the economy, and the topography of the territory. And it's some of the best, definitely from the American period, it's the first really detailed information we get for the whole of Alaska. And what I've put here in for you to look at is the the southeastern division, and he's got the Chilkat tribe, and what he's got there are two. Sorry about this. It's decided it wants to do its own thing. He's got Yendistuk, Kutwaklu, Klakwan, and Chilkoot, and the number of people in each. And his total is 988 people. So 988 people between the 4 villages that he notes as Chilkat. This is a picture of the 1890 census, and here is a man that is taking the census from this family that lives in this house. By the 1890 census, the U.S. had 62 million people, 62,979,766. And Alaska in that census had 32,052 people. So it was about the same as the 1880 census. This time he started, Petrov did this census as well, and he started in southeastern Alaska in February of 1890, and he finished in 1891. So, of course, as we in Southeast know, we're less likely to have snow and ice. We get a lot of rain in the winter, especially in the lower southeastern part of Alaska. So he was able to start earlier in the year and work his way up. 40% of the population was Tlingit. Now, the interesting thing about the 1890 census is we do not have the records. The individual records of that census were lost in January of 1921 in a fire in the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. And this is a picture of the storage room, and there are only portions of the census for different areas available to people. So it's a big gap. There's a 20-year gap now between the 1870 census, which was pretty bad, and the 1880 census, and then the 1900 census. And the 1870 census was pretty useless. In the 1890 census, these are the questions they asked people, and there are a number of them. We've listed an enumerator's form, put an enumerator's form on our website, but it's pretty interesting, some of the questions. Some of them you would expect: your address, the number of families in the house, rather than the number of persons in the house, and their names. But they are also asking whether a soldier, sailor, or Marine from the Union or the Confederate during the Civil War, or whether you were a widow of a person who would fit that description, whether you're the head of the family or not. That continues to this day in the census. The race, and this is where some of these terms would not be used today, but you are either black or white, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, Chinese, Japanese, or Indian. And Indian at this time does not mean from India. It would mean Native American. The mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon are references to the amount of African American blood that you would have. And so an octoroon would be 1/8 African American. The sex and age and marital status are still things that we cover, but being married within that year, I don't know why that would have been important to document and why that data was something they wanted to collect. They also wanted to collect how many children a woman had and how many were still living. So they're looking at the birth and death rates for children with that question. And they wanted to know the place of birth of a person and their father and mother. This was a land primarily of immigrants, and we celebrated that and acknowledged that, and they wanted to kind of have an idea of where people were coming from. They also wanted to know if you were foreign born, how many years you were in the U.S., whether you were naturalized, whether papers had been taken out. And all of those are questions that right now were hotly debated for this particular census that we're about to do in 2020. The profession, trade, or occupation of the person and the months unemployed during the census year, of course, are related to economy. They were also interested in the ability to read and write and the ability to speak English, and if unable, what language they did speak. And then there was, interestingly, this whether they were suffering from acute or chronic disease and naming the disease and the length of time afflicted. That's a question that has dropped off the census. They also want to know whether you were defective in mind, sight, hearing, or speech, or whether you were crippled, maimed, or deformed, and naming the defect again. And this may have been a layover from the Confederate Union, the Civil War, that there would have been a number of people that did have problems as a result of that war, did have physical ailments. They also want to know, and interestingly, this was all in one question, a prisoner, convict, homeless child, or pauper, if you were one of those. They want to know if your home was rented or owned by the head of the family, and if it was owned, whether it was free from mortgage. I don't believe, asked that question anymore either. And if you were a farmer, whether the farm is rented or owned by the head of family. If it's owned, is it free from mortgage? If it's rented, who is the owner of it? So it's sort of an interesting array of questions that would give you a lot of information looking back on it. Unfortunately, we have no 1890 records that we can look back on for Alaska. So pulling it together for our region, the Chilkat numbers, in the 1700s, the only number that we have is from Vancouver, when he was met in Lynn Canal by canoes coming out of the Chilkat, and there were 500 people in those canoes. We know that there must have been a significantly greater number of people back in the villages for 500 to come out and meet him. The 1835, Douglas counted 2,400 in the Chilkat region. Veniaminov counted 200 in 1837. Again, we had in between those 2 years, we had the smallpox. Now, whether Veniaminov is only counting men or whether he's only counting Christians or what's going on here with that number, but it is. I would hope that we didn't lose 90% of the population here to the smallpox. That would be really horrific. The 1857, Ptolemy has 250. By 1861, it's coming back up to 1,616, 1,200 in 1867, 1868. 1867 is when we were purchased by America, by the U.S. And then 1868, 2,000 people is what Halleck counted in the Chilkat. And 1869, 2,500. 1881, Petrov counted 988. And in 1890, Petrov again counted 812. So there were some disease incidents that came through, or people left looking for work. In the 1900 census, because they had learned from Petrov, he did not do the 1900 census, but they learned that it was hard to get counts out of Alaska. It was hard to get around. The census supervisor arrived the year before. So he arrived in April of 1899. And his enumerators and enumerators are the people that go out in the field and get the data, began collecting data in July of 1899, although the official start was June 1st of 1900. So they were a whole year early that they started collecting the data. And they found that it was much easier to travel because of the gold rush. There was improved infrastructure and better communication. Now, 1900 is when we really started to see an explosion of things like telegraph lines and roads and just an explosion of things in our infrastructure. That's when we started getting lighthouses. The enumerators finished in the census year 1900 in October. So they were able to work faster than Petrov with the first. And this is the census form. It's significantly smaller than the 1891, which was asking about whether or not you had diseases. But there's some interesting things that happened. This census showed a 21% increase in the US, 76 million people now. But it showed a 50% increase in Alaska. Remember, the gold rushes happened in between the two censuses. So 63,592 people. The Chilkat Valley is counted now at 1,305. In August 11th, 1900, the Census Bureau thought it had lost 3 of its enumerators, William Pine Coffin, Charles and Josephine Robinson, on the Yukon River. They were trying to get to a remote area, and they were in a boat, and the boat never showed up where it was supposed to show up. So they eventually did show up at St. Michael, and they had their census forms intact. They did not lose the data. But they did make the Chicago Tribune as 3 lost in Alaska, and it was quite a harrowing experience for their loved ones who were trying to find out what had happened to them. Mrs. Josephine DeMott Robinson took advantage of this and later wrote of her adventures from McCall's magazine. She had a 3-part article that romanticized her life in Alaska, where she was both a prospector and a census taker. And here she is in the image with the men, and it was published in 1927. And she says, "But I begged them to stop thinking about food and just drink lots and lots of tea." And this is from the Alaska Historical Museum and Library. So what did the census records look like here? Well, we have 67 pages of census records, and we're going to try to upload them onto our website for you. There were, of these 67, there seemed to be 3 distinct groups of people. So one is native villages, and the Chilkat villages, the people are called Chilkat for their tribe. In the Chilkoot village, the people are called Indian. And this is an example of the native village census form, and you can see that some people don't have last names. Some people, they try to spell out what they hear of the native name. And some people are using a Western name. Some people do have a last name. And then I will go to the other side of the form here. This gives the date, June 19th, 1900. And it says the tribe or clan, where were they born, where were their parents born, and they all were born in Alaska. And this is the citizenship questions here. And then where did they work? At home. Home is, so if you were a cannery worker, home would be your winter residence, but they're taking this in the summer, so these people are coming in the summer. And what occupation did they have at home, and what occupation did they have here? Now, in the native tribes, the occupations were either at home, as you can see, and that would be what a lot of children would have, fisherman, basket worker, this one is moccasins, laborer, fisherman, at home, fisherwoman, basket maker, blanket maker. So a lot of the crafts, they're canoe makers. We can count how many canoe makers we had in the valley from our census. A lot of the things, the product that the Chilkats were creating are listed as their occupation. It's also interesting, there are some people that are listed in the native villages as being housekeepers, and they would be working in the fort or for different people. Those people tended to be ones that did read and write English. The others, to a larger part, none of the people in the native villages read or wrote English. The other area that we had at that time were the mining camps, and this is McKinley Creek in the Porcupine District. And these people, their name, their date of locating to Alaska. So 1898 was a big year for people to come, 1897, 1899. So they're coming up for gold. This is their post office address or their address at home, Crookston, Seattle, Sagola, Michigan, Washington, Ontario, California. So this is where they consider home. And this is then their relation to each other. So there's a head of house, wife, son. Over here are dates of birth and sex, male, female, and whether they're married or single. And then on the next one, we have their birth, where they're born, where their place of birth of their father and of their mother. So when you look at this closely, you start to see some interesting things. Most of them, if they weren't born abroad, they have a parent that was. So here, there's a father from Scotland. Here is New York. This is another from Scotland. Ireland. Both parents are from Ireland, and he was born in Ireland. And so it gives the names of, the places that these people were born. In here is the profession back home and the profession in the Chilkat Valley. So most of these are mining. This one is a mail carrier, but at home he was the iceman. These at home was a fuel dealer. Now he's a miner. This woman was a photographer at home, but now she's at home in the Chilkat Valley. This one was at home, and I think this is a child. Logger, iceman, and now the loggers are miners and the iceman's the mail carrier. A laborer back home, now a miner. A logger. This one is a stair builder, a grocery merchant, a salesman, a blacksmith, a mariner, a stock raiser, a clerk, a farmer. So, and this one was at school back home, and they all came here to be miners. Some of them had more experience than others. The third area was the fishing industry and canneries. And so this is Chilkoot in Alaska, and it's the Chilkoot Packing Company cannery. And this is where we see another group of immigrants who've come in. And some of them, I'm not showing one of the pages that showed a lot of people from Asia. This one is just a lot of people. They're all coming up from Washington or Oregon. And when you look at on this side, their parents, this one was born in England. Their parents were from England. This one was born in Washington, but their parents are from Ireland. This one's from Maine. So they're coming from a little further afield, Norway, Finland, Russia. And cannery is sort of in their blood. Salmon canning, canning, superintendent of canning. This one's a carpenter back home and a carpenter here, an engineer back home, an engineer here, a fisherman back home, and now he's on the night watch at the cannery. He was a ship carpenter, and now he's a carpenter in the cannery. So and then a lot of fishermen. Fishermen, there's laborer, carpenter, but fisherman, carpenter, fisherman. So a lot of these people are doing what they did back home here. They're not retraining into a new line of work, where the miners are definitely coming in and doing something they've never done before. So that's some of the interesting stuff that you can learn from the census records. And I have some terms here for children to discuss with their parents. Enumerator, census, data, Creole, smallpox, epidemic, legislative districts, reapportion, and naturalized are some of the terms. And you may pull some other ones out from the census records. For the older kids, we have posted a link to the 1900 census enumerators form and a copy of the 1890 form. And it might be interesting to print those forms off, compare and contrast them. discuss why certain data is important and what data you think should be on a census record, what would be important, and maybe do a census record for your family. Record the data on the people that are living in your residence, and then consider discussing and perhaps even imagining, and you could recreate, what hardships would you encounter getting that data in a place like Alaska. We all know that Alaska is not always the easiest place to get around, and especially right now when there's no way to get around. But how would you get that data? So that's our challenge for the children, and I hope you enjoyed this Facebook Live presentation.